different township libraries. I just want to say thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Ms. Miller for joining us this evening. Very warm welcome to Madeline Miller. Ms. Miller grew up in New York City and Philadelphia and currently lives in the area. Her first book, The Song of Achilles, has won several awards, including the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction, rare accomplishment for a debut novel. Her second book, Circe, has also received a number of awards and was our library's favorite book in 2019. Circe is currently being made into a miniseries by HBO. Ms. Miller joins us tonight to talk about her work and to answer questions and engage in a conversation with us. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Ms. Miller. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for because I know that the book was selected because all of you voted for it. So thank you so much. Thank you for supporting libraries, and thank you for your kind support of Circe too. I wanted to start by reading a very short passage from Circe. And I always like to start with reading a passage. It's only about a minute, because these ancient stories that I was inspired by, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were originally performed. They were performed usually with music, and they were sung. I'm not going to sing, I have a terrible voice, but it was really important for me when I was writing both my novels that they have sort of an oral presence to them. And I did a lot of practicing reading them out loud because I wanted to honor that part of, you know, the original works. They came out of oral tradition, passed down and passed down and passed down, not just from bard to bard, but from family to family. So, you know, these stories have this incredibly wonderful and rich background where they weren't just created by one person. They were created by everyone kind of working and telling the stories together. So this section that I'm going to read, Circe in Greek mythology, is the daughter of the sun god Helios. She is a goddess, and she's also a witch. And it was her witchcraft that I was really interested in. She's born a goddess, but a witch is what she chooses to be. And in this section, she has already discovered her witchcraft. She is on the magical island of Aiaia, where she will later on encounter Odysseus's men and transform them into pigs. And in this section, she has already started turning men into pigs, and she's actually having a conversation with Odysseus about that. Odysseus asked me once, "Why pigs?" We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide, with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. "Why not?" I said. He gave me a bare smile. "I mean it, I would like to know." I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden, this was his highest worship. There were answers in me, I felt them, buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall, when my lions were gone and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them, scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all, their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. Come, I would say to them, it's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs. So my relationship to these stories really goes back a long way into my childhood. It goes back to my mom, who was a librarian. who would read me little pieces of the Iliad and the Odyssey as bedtime stories. And I completely fell in love with these stories and wanted to read every version of the myth I could. I went off to my school that offered Latin, thank goodness, and I started taking Latin, and then I came here to Philadelphia for high school. I went to Shipley, and I had a wonderful Latin teacher who is still there, David Rich, who saw that I loved these stories and offered to teach me Greek. And so I went from adoring Latin and Virgil to adoring Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey in the original, and knowing that I wanted to head off to college and continue to study these things. But of course, one of the things that I couldn't help but notice as I'm reading all these stories and hearing all these poets and falling in love with them and thinking, oh my goodness, this is, you know, such incredible literature. There were two things that I couldn't help but notice. One is that, of course, all these voices, with very, very few exceptions, are male aristocrats. Those are the people whose poetry has survived. Now we have a few. We have Sulpicia, we have Sappho, we have a couple voices from the ancient world that don't fall into that category, but for the most part, that's who it is. So we're getting this very, very small view. At the same time, I also couldn't help but notice how often the stories are dominated by those same voices. So, you know, the female characters oftentimes in Greek mythology are very flat. They tend to be very secondary. If their story is really exciting, they might get to die in it to motivate the male hero. But for the most part, they're relegated to being sort of wife, daughter, mother. They're these sort of very sidelined roles of whoever is the hero of the main action. Now, there are, of course, a couple of big female characters like Clytemnestra, Medea, even Antigone, but these tend to be sort of women who kind of cause destruction wherever they go. They tend to be kind of the big villains. And by the way, I love all those characters, but I was interested in, you know, where are the characters who are these three-dimensional characters? And it wasn't just women who I felt like were missing. There were lots of voices that were missing. The voices of slaves, for instance, are largely kind of passed over. And in fact, oftentimes when the texts are taught, the slavery thing is oftentimes the word slave gets translated as something softer in English, like servant, maid, words that kind of obscure the fact that this was a heavily slave, you know, society filled with people who were suffering, you know, in slavery. So that's what I started to notice. And I started to feel like, well, I love these stories so much, but I want to push back a little bit. I wish that these worlds were a little bit bigger. I wish that this perspective was a little bit bigger. And one of the characters where I felt that most strongly was in the character of Circe. And I think I felt that way because, you know, the first time I encountered Circe, I was 13, and we were reading the Odyssey in my 8th grade English class. Now, I had heard about Circe in sort of my Greek myth reading in general, that there was this witch in the Odyssey who turned men into pigs. And I thought, finally, a really interesting character. And so I was really excited for her scenes in the Odyssey. I thought, well, this is going to be really interesting. She's clearly smart and complicated, and she's going to give Odysseus a run for his money, and there's going to be a great scene between the two of them. But if you've actually read the Circe scene in the Odyssey, what happens is she turns Odysseus's men into pigs. Then Odysseus comes to confront her. He has had help from Hermes. Hermes has given him something that makes him immune to her spells. She tries to turn him into a pig. It doesn't work. And instead of them having a really interesting kind of banter, discussion, back and forth battle of wits, he pulls his sword on her and he threatens her. And she screams and falls to her knees and begs for mercy and invites him into her bed in one speech. And I was so frustrated as a 13-year-old. I just remember thinking, you know, that's it. That's all she gets. You know, she has to be literally put on her knees in front of the male hero. And you know, I didn't know at that time that feeling of frustration would eventually become this novel. But I do think that was the seed. That was where it all started. Now, as I continued to study classics, I came back to Circe many more times because I came back to the Odyssey many more times. And what I started to realize as an older student was yes, her character is very flat and very constricted. But actually, it has more nuance than oftentimes Circe is given credit for in later versions of her story. So actually, usually in later versions after Homer, Circe is treated as one of those villains, like Medea, like Clytemnestra. She's treated as the man-hater, the spider at the center of her web, the seductress, the false woman. But what's interesting about her is that in Homer, after that moment where she and Odysseus come to an understanding, they do in fact become lovers. She invites him to stay on her island with his men. She says to him, you and your men are exhausted. You've lost 11 of your 12 ships coming home from this war, and you've been in the war for 10 years. You've seen death and destruction. You're demoralized. Stay here and heal. And so she hosts him on her island for an entire year. And Odysseus spends the whole Odyssey agitating to get home. He's constantly wanting to go back to Ithaca, to go back to his wife, who by the time he gets home, it's been 20 years he's been away. He wants to see his son, who he left when he was just a baby and now, has grown up and had his whole life without Odysseus. So you can understand his longing to get home. He wants the Greek word is nostos. He wants his homecoming. And we actually have the English word nostalgia from that. Nostos, homecoming, and the algia is pain. So nostalgia is that pain you feel when you want home. So he wants his nostos. And he talks again and again throughout the Odyssey of how much he wants to get home, how much he wants to be with his family. And every place they stop in the Odyssey, they talk about how much he wants to leave. Except for Circe's island. Her island is the only place where actually his men have to come to him and say, okay, are you going to go? Are we going to finally get going? And so he says, okay, yes, you're right. And he goes to Circe. And he says, I'm ready to leave. And she says, great, here's what you need to know. You have to go down to the underworld and talk to this. Actually, he has to technically call a dead prophet out of the underworld and talk to him. He has to get past all these monsters. And so she starts sort of giving him all this advice. Here's the sacrificial animals you need to perform the ritual to call the dead from the underworld. Here's what you should do when you go past the monsters. You have to put beeswax in your men's ears so they won't hear the sirens, which enchant people's senses. And she just sort of goes on and on and on, giving him all this incredibly useful advice that you could basically only get from a witch. And she, then sends him on his way. And so what I realized as an older student is, actually, Circe is one of the most helpful characters that he encounters. She gives him this moment of healing, and then she sends him on his way with the best possible advice and all the supplies that he could need. So from that sense, I sort of also was interested in Circe because I wanted to, go back to that, her double nature in Homer. Yes, she is frightening, but she also is benevolent and healing. So I was very drawn to that. I was also really drawn in by this kind of throwaway description of her in the Odyssey as being the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And that word, speaking like a human, it's just one word in the Greek. It's audeessa. And it's a little bit mysterious. Scholars have debated it. But as a writer, I came to feel that suddenly as a novelist, this is the nice thing about having sort of an academic background, is I feel like I can use my academic skills to look at the poetry, but then I can allow my novelist imagination to take over. And so the things that I feel about what I see, I don't have to prove, which is always nice. So the thing that I felt, but I'm not sure I could prove it in a paper, but I felt it as a novelist, was that what that meant, her ability to speak like a human, was really her ability to feel compassion and to feel empathy and to reach out to others in the world. Now, if you know the Greek myths, you know that the Greek gods generally are absolutely horrendous. They are violent, petty, cruel, completely selfish and self-absorbed. If you anger them, they'll punish you and your children and your children's children on down through the centuries. Today, we would call them sociopathic narcissists. And so I was really interested in the idea of this goddess who was born among sociopathic narcissists, but who has the ability to feel compassion like humans do. And it also located her at this really interesting space for me, sort of straddling two worlds. And I think characters who straddle two worlds are always fascinating because they sort of have a foot in either, but they have perspective on both. And so they can see things and comment on things, you know, and they're outsiders. And that outsider, the fact that they're outsiders can often be challenging, but it can also give them insight that insiders don't have. So I was really interested in that aspect of her. I also love the fact I mentioned that she was a witch. Now, witchcraft and divinity are totally different things in the ancient world. Divinity is, you know, gives you the type of power that's like the snap your fingers, Shazam type of power. You think it and it happens. Witchcraft is born out of planning, harvesting, skill, experience, knowledge, dedication. It takes time, it takes preparation. In other words, as I was thinking about it, it's an art. And I was really, really interested in the idea of Circe as an artist, that her witchcraft is, you know, could be a metaphor for really any creative endeavor, that it's not something that comes easily. It comes through this hard work. And it's only through that work that you can really create change in the world. You can create transformation in the world, which is what she does. The final thing that I was really interested in also with Circe was that I would get to explore this much larger world of mythology with her. So she was not the only character I was interested in kind of bringing three-dimensional aspects to. I was also really interested in looking at, for example, Penelope, Odysseus's wife, or Medea, who shows up, or Circe's sister, Pasiphae, the mother of the Minotaur, who's a very, very interesting figure. So those were all characters that I wanted to kind of bring out. And as well, I wanted to bring out the fact that, you know, here she is. Hang on one second. That's my cat and also my daughter downstairs. So I really apologize. We're all getting really real in the age of Zoom and the pandemic. So hang on one second. All right, I apologize about that. You're getting a background into my real life. But what I wanted to say about sort of the final thing that drew me in is, and all those other characters, is that any society that is oppressing 50% of its population, i.e. all the women, is actually oppressing much more than that. That, you know, in any society where you are forcing women into gender roles, you're also forcing, you know, everyone else into gender roles. And so I wanted to look at characters like, for instance, Telemachus, Odysseus's son, who doesn't want to be a hero like his father. He looks at his father's life and he sees only blood and death. And he doesn't want that kind of life. And so he is also struggling with sort of the expectations of society on him, that, you know, this is a society that is constricting a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. One of the things that I have always loved about mythology, aside from, you know, of course, the stories are exciting, they're filled with gods and monsters, but I think what keeps me coming back to them is how incredibly real they still feel. That when I read them, sometimes people will ask me, you know, how do you, you know, make this feel relevant? And my answer is, I don't really feel like I have to do anything. I feel like it's all there in the text. Absolutely, you know, anything that we are dealing with today, we were dealing with back then. The ancients would say nothing new under the sun. You know, technology has changed and culture has changed, but we have not changed. And so, you know, the Iliad opens with a pandemic being, you know, mismanaged by selfish leaders. I mean, that's the first scene of the Iliad. You know, here we are again, like the wheel comes full circle. And so literally anything that we are talking about today, they were talking about in the ancient world. And sometimes what I have to do is I sort of have to open it up to allow that to be there. But, you know, what is the story of the Aeneid but a story of refugees? The Aeneid is Virgil's the great Roman answer to the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's the story of, in some ways you can think of it as the first, you know, the original fan fiction It's Virgil saying, let's do it again, but from the Trojan perspective. What happens to the Trojans after the Trojan War? Their city has been burned. Everyone in their city, most of the people in their city have been killed. The people who started the war are basically all dead. The people who are left are just the remnants of this terrible, terrible 10-year-long siege. And they have nothing left. They literally have what they were wearing when they ran out of the city when it burned. And they now have to go find a new place to live. And not everywhere wants them to come. And they're trying to find a new place where they can thrive and have a new home. You know, refugees are something we're talking about today, and how difficult it is, and the violence that they're fleeing from, and how hard it can be to find a new place, and how unwelcoming the world can be to refugees. So all these things are all there in the ancient material. And unfortunately, this is, you know, very true for things that Circe struggles with as a woman: sexual assault, being belittled, being undermined, being kept from the halls of power. You know, we have definitely made progress, but we still have a long way to go. So, you know, looking at all these things, it's very much still relevant and still fresh. So it's something that I think about a lot. Now I'm gonna pause for a second because I can see that there, oh my gosh, I don't know if you guys can all see the chat, but Max, who is Alicia's brother, is also here. Hello, Max. It's so wonderful to see you. He was also a fabulous student. So I would love to take questions. If people have questions, please put them in the chat. There's a lot more I could say about mythology, but one of the nice things about Zoom is that I can take questions kind of as I go. So if there are things that you want me to say or that you'd like me to address, I'm happy to dig more into them. And nothing is off limits, anything about publishing or that history. If you want me to drag my cat into the picture, I can. She's still like climbing over boxes in the background. My apologies. I hope you can't hear it too loudly. But I see that there's one question about what the next book is. So the next book, this has a little bit of a long answer, and Alicia and Max have a little bit of a insight into this, because the other thing that I love, other than classics, is directing Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. And I absolutely love working in Shakespeare's world, and there's been a particular play that actually I really don't like to direct, and I think that's why I want to write about it, and that play is The Tempest. So I've been working on and thinking about The Tempest for several years now. So I think my Tempest play, my Tempest novel, is going to be next. But after that, I would love to dig into the world of the Aeneid. I find Virgil so interesting and the Aeneid so interesting. So I think The Tempest first and then the Aeneid.
I'm going to jump in.
Hello to Sharwaggle as well.
Madeline, can I jump in for just a second and tell you that Hildy actually sent a question 9 days ago via email. So she really wanted to get her question answered. So do you feel like your takes differ from the originals? Do you feel like you've deviated at all? Do you feel like you've differed from the originals, or that you've kind of just explored them more differently?
Yes and no. So in some ways I felt like my answer is different depending on whether we're talking about Song of Achilles or whether we're talking about Circe. So with Song of Achilles, I felt like I was bringing to life a version of the story that was hidden in plain sight. The idea of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers and taking their relationship as a romantic one was widespread, widely accepted in the ancient world. It's referenced in Plato, it's referenced by Aeschylus, it's all over the place. But that had kind of disappeared in more modern times. And one of the things that I want to do is kind of bring that back and set their love story at the center of the novel. So I felt like I actually wanted to stay pretty close to the Iliad, because what I wanted to do was say, it's all here. It's all already here. Achilles' grief, his incredibly intense physical mourning over Patroclus's body, where he embraces Patroclus and holds him all night long. These are things that are already there. And so I wanted to stay pretty close to it because I wanted to be pointing to things that are already there that kind of tell this story. So I was just illuminating, I was opening up a story that I felt was already there. Now with Circe, I wanted to push back a little bit more. I mentioned how she kneels before Odysseus in the Odyssey. I knew that my Circe was not going to kneel. And in a sense, actually, I felt kind of like Homer was inviting me to push back more in Circe, because the episode of Circe in the Odyssey is one of the few episodes that is not told by the poet. It's actually told by Odysseus himself. And he's telling it to some people that he's staying with, that he's trying to impress. And so once I started thinking about the scene from that perspective, it started to look really different. So all of a sudden, okay, so here's the story Odysseus is telling. Oh, there was this terrifying witch, and she totally got the jump on my men, but then I tamed her. And then she threw herself at me, and she was super hot, which is what he says over and over and over again. And every time you kind of realize that, every time he says, oh, she's so attractive, she's so powerful, what he's really saying is, look how good I am. And so what I realized is, okay, this is Odysseus' self-aggrandizing. He's constantly obsessed in the Odyssey with burnishing his own legend. And that's what this story is. So this is Odysseus's, burnishing of his own legend. He's trying to make himself look good, and he's had the stage for 3,000 years. So now let's try to strip that away and look instead at how Circe might have experienced this. And I really tried to take very small details in the text and transform them from, Circe being the object of Odysseus's gaze to Circe being the subject of her own story. So one of the sort of details is that Odysseus describes her as Circe with this fancy hair. Oftentimes it's translated as Circe of the beautiful braids. And one of the things about that I found really, really interesting is that basically he's kind of describing her as like this, as if she just spends all her time hanging out looking, ready for prom. And that's kind of what her days are like, just waiting for someone to show up. And I thought, well, that's, what an objectifying, what a fantasy way to describe all this. And so instead I wanted to think, well, here's Circe. She's a witch. She spends all her time in the woods with lions and with wolves. She spends all her time digging up plants. Of course she would put up her hair. That just makes sense. And so I tried to transform even small details like, this idea of her braids. Instead of being at this thing that she's doing to make herself attractive, this is something that she's doing because it makes sense for, for what she's doing. She's not just sitting around all the time. So I tried to look at things like that. But I also grew more and more comfortable with changing things or with leaving things out. Circe in one myth turns this guy into a woodpecker. I was not interested. I left it out. So, one of the nice things about mythology is that it isn't an academic paper. So I can sort of follow the things that I feel strongly about. But I do like sort of being in conversation with Homer and feeling like I'm kind of have a little bit of a back and forth there. Okay,
a lot of people have asked to see your cat.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. Well, I may have to move. Hang on one second. I'm gonna actually text my husband for a little bit of help because she has gotten herself really in an interesting situation that I don't think I can get her out of. So I'm gonna have him get her and bring her over and say hi and then remove her.
Okay. That sounds like a plan. While that's happening, think about, did you write Circe's ending as open-ended? I personally did not realize that there was alternate interpretations until I saw discussions online. So think about that while you're taking care of your cat.
Okay, I will. Yes, so for me, the importance of Circe's ending, and I think there may be some people who haven't read the book, so I don't want to give spoilers. So I'm going to tread a little carefully here. But I feel like one of the things that I wanted was I really wanted her story to end on a leap of faith. that so much of her society and her sort of background has been about questioning her, doubting her, silencing her, and that part of her journey is, you know, really about sort of, you know, at the core, I saw this as a story of a woman, an artist, struggling to find a place for herself, to trust herself, to believe her own voice, and to use that voice in the world. And so at the end, I wanted it to end on this idea of her having ultimate faith in herself to choose her own form and her own life. I have a pretty strong opinion about what happens next, but I also am one of those annoying authors who thinks that once I've written the book, it belongs to my readers as much as to me. So whatever you think is valid.
That kind of brings us into, somebody would like to know, are you very involved in the miniseries? And I guess in tying to that, I'd also like to add, how closely do you feel like the miniseries is going to follow your novel?
Yes. So I'm not very involved, which is okay with me because I know absolutely nothing about screenplays and nothing about how to transform something into a mini-series. If this were, for example, a stage play, I would be a lot more controlling because I am a director. So I feel like I know a little something about the theater and how to transform something on the stage. But I really don't know how to do this. And I kind of feel like Circe's story is all about transformation. So in some ways, I'm excited to see what the next transformation is. How is it going to have to change in order to be in this different format? I was very, very careful about the people that I gave the book to. I felt really like I wanted to make sure that they loved the parts of Circe that I loved, that they felt strongly about the parts of her story that I felt strongly about. And so the people I gave the book to really impressed me with their passion for her story. So I feel like I gave it to the best possible people, and now I can't wait to see what they do with it.
So we've got questions in both our question and answer box and our chat box. So I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth. Shar says, thank you so much for these wonderful books and congratulations. Her question is, given the relatively short shrift that Homer gave Circe, did you draw on other depictions of witches throughout, or did you develop her story more through your own agency?
So first of all, hello to Shar, who is a master teacher and the mom of two amazing children, Alicia and Max. And I had the good fortune to teach with Shar, and so I'm so happy to see you here. Thank you. Hello. So I definitely did a lot of research into the literary history of witches. And I thought a lot about what it meant to be a witch in literature and how there's sort of all these different configurations of witches. So, you know, there's the classic like hag type in Macbeth, you know, double, double, toil and trouble, the disgusting witches who use disgusting ingredients for, you know, disgusting reasons. There's also the foreign witch, the witch who's from someplace else, and her sort of foreignness and her power kind of combine together to become one terrifying thing. You know, of course, she's a scary witch. She's from someplace else. You see that character in Medea, who's from someplace, she's from Colchis, which is outside of Greece. You can see it in Tituba in The Crucible. You can also see it in Sycorax, Caliban's mother, in The Tempest. So this idea of sort of the foreign witch is very much one of the pieces. There's also the seductress witch, which is kind of what Circe is. There's also the good witch who does show up. And one of the most interesting things that I found as I was looking sort of through material was actually the scholar whose name is Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And she was kind of an early feminist, and she was one of the first people who was saying stuff like, hey, you know, this whole thing about burning witches, I don't really think this is about fighting the devil. I actually think this is about misogyny and oppressing women, which now sounds like duh. but at the time was really revolutionary. She was sort of at the same time as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And what she said is, actually, we've been looking at witches completely wrong. Witches are usually the herbalists. They're the doctors of their villages. They're the scientists of their villages. We should be honoring these women. These are women who are scapegoated for having knowledge and power. And we should be appreciating them rather than vilifying them. And so, side note about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, I always like to share this because it's one of the coolest things I found in my research, even though it has nothing to do with Circe, is that actually Matilda Jocelyn Gage had a daughter, and that daughter married this guy whose name was L. Frank Baum, the writer of the Oz series. And not only did she encourage him to write his stories down, but Glinda the Good Witch and sort of the idea of witches being so prominent in his stories came right from him honoring his mother-in-law's work. So she is kind of responsible for the Oz books as well, even though she wasn't the writer. But one of the things that I think kept coming up for me is, what does it really mean to be a witch? And for me, the way I came to define it was, really what it means to be a witch is to be a woman who has more power than society is comfortable with. It's an amount of power that makes the people around her uncomfortable. It's an amount of power that can't be controlled by the people around her. And what's so interesting to me about the word witch is how incredibly current it still is, that we still use this word to insult women. But I also feel like there's been this big movement of reclaiming witches and witchcraft and sort of, you know, exactly as Matilda Jocelyn Gage would have wanted, that the women who were being killed, these were women who were, you know, the doctors, they were the midwives, they were the women who really knew how to work with stuff and heal people. So I'm glad that there's also been this kind of counter movement. As I was creating Circe's character, I definitely was thinking about all that. I was also thinking about her as a healer showing up in the Odyssey, and I was also kind of thinking about her as I was influenced a little bit by the fact that she and Penelope in one of the myths eventually become friends. And so I was thinking about that. Now, she and Penelope are very, very different, but that also kind of went into creating. So, you know, someone who's very independently minded, who's interested in healing, who's incredibly skilled with working with herbs, you know, someone who is an outsider, someone who has an amount of power that makes people afraid, someone who is defiant, who knows that they have that amount of power, that they're shunned by society, but that they do it anyway. So in a way, that all did go into creating Circe.
Amazing. Julia would like to know, how much of a plan do you prepare before you write? Do you know the ending from the beginning?
I do know the ending, and I feel like that's basically all I know is just the ending. And I don't know it in the sense of, I haven't written the final scene. I know sort of vaguely the note that I want to end on. But usually my problem is that I can't find the beginning. And so I have to spend 5 years, literally 5 years in the case of both my novels, trying to find out what the beginning is and where do I start the story. And then once I already know the ending. And then when I find that beginning, then I can kind of shoot the arrow between them. But I need to find out where the story starts. That's always my big problem. I don't have too much of a plan as I go. With Circe, there were 4 major myths about Circe that I knew I wanted to use, and they were kind of the pillars of my novel, but I didn't necessarily know what order I wanted them to go in. And I didn't know what was going to happen around them. For me, but I see both of my novels as really kind of about, you know, characters growing up and coming into their own and discovering who they are. And so a lot of the plot is internal. It's the character growing up and kind of figuring themselves out. And so I can't really plan for chapter 18 until I have written chapter 17, because I don't really know who Circe is yet until I've gotten there. And then once I kind of have built this rough draft, then I go back and I edit and I edit and I edit like crazy. But really what I'm doing is sort of developing the character's psychology as I go. And that psychology for me is kind of the core of the plot. And if I plot it out ahead of time, then it ends up feeling very dull. I always really like my characters to surprise me. And Circe did surprise me at a number of moments, and so did other characters around her. Daedalus, the character of Daedalus, the master craftsman, was a huge surprise. I knew he was going to have a brief cameo and then off stage again, but he just kept kind of hanging around, and he kept wanting to say things and have scenes, and Circe kept being interested in him. And now looking back on it, I sort of realized, well, of course, Daedalus is the first fellow artist that she meets. He's the first person who really understands what she's trying to do. And he also, he's a parent, and his love for his child is very moving to her. And so she doesn't have children, but she's very moved by this idea that a parent could love a child, since she hasn't exactly grown up with that. So I always want to leave room for characters to grow and change and shift and sort of take up more space or less space as they need to.
Awesome. Pamela says that she is also a classicist and a studier of literature and enjoys your novels very much. She understands your desire to give the woman's perspective, but wonders why you found it necessary to make Odysseus so hateful.
I love this question because every detail I have in there about Odysseus is from ancient literature. But most of them are not well known, because they're not in the Odyssey. And the Odyssey has become like the runaway breakout hit from the ancient world. It was just voted like, the #1 story of all time in a BBC poll. And what's interesting about the Odyssey, it is the most positive portrait of Odysseus from the ancient world. And all the others are much more negative or mixed. In a couple tragedies, he's just straight up the villain. And in many versions of his story, he's seen as, the ancients really were very suspicious of him. He was the great liar and manipulator. He was the politician. He was the puppet master. And so they had very ambivalent feelings about him. And he makes a wonderful foil with Achilles, because Achilles in the Iliad has this great line where he says, I hate like the gates of death, the man who says one thing and hides another in his heart, which is, of course, the definition of Odysseus. And so it's interesting that even within Homer, these characters are arguing with each other, that Odysseus lies his way across the Mediterranean, but Achilles says, no, honesty is what's important. And one of the brilliant things about I think the Iliad and the Odyssey is that we see the faults of both of those, that, these ancient Greek heroes are not heroes the way we talk about today, where we talk about people who are moral exemplars. The ancient Greek heroes were full of pride and faults, and there are many, many times in the Iliad where you wish Achilles could be, a little bit less honest for his own good, but he kind of feels and he speaks, and that's who Achilles is, whereas Odysseus is constantly manipulating, and I saw him as kind of the great chameleon, and there's a real strength in that, in being able to change yourself and shift yourself to the situation. But also, if you do it long enough, do you have a self anymore? What is that self? If you're constantly hiding yourself, do you even have it anymore? And I would argue that the end of the Odyssey actually shows that Odysseus has lost himself in a lot of ways. So even the Odyssey, I think, questions Odysseus. But all these other things about him smashing babies against walls, about him, killing people in rage, and all of those things, they're all from other sources. So partially what I was doing was actually kind of restoring more of the ancient complete view of him, as opposed to, because of course everyone loves Odysseus today because he's the smart one, and also he's got a great wife. And so I think Penelope has done a lot of service for Odysseus over the years because she's so interesting that, we think anyone who appreciates her, he must be be kind of great too. But the ancients didn't feel that way about him. They were very, very mixed on him. So so I personally don't, you know, hate Odysseus, but I'm really, really glad I don't have to live with him also.
Caitlin would like to know, how did you go about finding a literary agent or publisher for your first book?
Great question. It was a long road, and I didn't have any connections in the industry at all. I really had only ever written by myself. And so what I ended up doing was just going to an online database that had, I don't think they exist anymore, Writer's Market, that had sort of a database of agents. And I typed in, give me names of agents who are interested in literary fiction, historical fiction, LGBTQIA stories, and also myth. And I figured that anyone who represented all those things and was interested in those things would probably like Song of Achilles. And I generated a big, big list. And then I went and researched each of those agents individually. I looked up what other authors they represented. I looked up their interviews and the types of things they said about their authors and about how they felt about reading and books. I also looked in the back of, this is a really sneaky trick, but if you have favorite writers, look in the acknowledgement section, and they will often list their agent. And so you can add that person to the list if you feel like you really love their work. So I definitely thank my agent, the amazing Julie Bearer in my book. If you are interested in anything about the publishing industry or getting an agent, I highly, highly, highly recommend the book Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Malm. It came out in January, and it came out in paperback, which bless her. And it is really, I think, the best path to writing, and in all, it's sort of the business of writing from beginning to end. And even as someone who had already published 2 novels, I felt like I learned stuff from reading it. So I wish I had had that when I was starting out as a writer. So if any of you out there are writers, Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Malm, M-A-U-M. So I sent out 80 letters to agents on that list, and I got back something like 78 rejections. But one of the yeses I got was from one of my top choices. It was this agent I was really, really hoping to hear from, which was Julie Bearer. And she and I had a conversation. She asked to see my manuscript. She read it in a weekend and got back to me. And that was it. I knew that she was the one. And so I was very, very glad that I had spread such a wide net, and I felt very, very lucky that I heard back from someone that I really, whose work I loved.
Amazing. Max would like to know, is your plan to focus on Aeneas or to zoom in on another under character that has the potential to reveal more of their story? Then he continues with, suspecting that Dido would be a good character.
Max, you're thinking right the way I'm thinking. I definitely would not spotlight Aeneas. I would definitely be looking at the side characters, and in that I think I would actually be following Virgil, because Virgil says at the beginning of the Aeneid, he says that founding the Roman people and the Trojans, according to his myth, become the Romans. Founding the Roman people was very heavy. It was a very heavy job. And part of that heaviness we see in the Aeneid is all these characters who have to die in order for Aeneas to fulfill his glorious destiny as the founder of the Roman people. And so I would definitely be interested in all those characters who are sort of left behind as he ascends to his glory. And also, of course, questioning that glory. And I will tell you that I certainly have recently been purchasing books on Carthage. So you know me well, Max. Dido was the queen of Carthage.
Wonderful. So we have got about 8 minutes left. And I would like to go to Rachel. Asks, Rachel and her family would like to know, are there any authors or books that you would recommend for us who love your works?
Thank you. Well, there have been so many great books I've read recently. I loved Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. I've been recommending that all over the place. I loved Conjure Women by Afia Atakara. It's her last name, Atakara, Atakora. Brilliant. Speaking of, it's sort of witches in the antebellum South and during the Civil War and after. So it's called Conjure Women. What else did I read? I just read something amazing. Oh, A Burning. Like everyone else, I thought A Burning was incredible. And there's one more. Oh, Cantoris by Carolina de Robertis. Oh my gosh, that book just completely blew my mind. It is, I'm in love with it. So all those.
Great.
Maybe I don't know if you know what I can do is at the end of this, I'll type them. If you want, I can type them in the chat at the end. If people
that would be wonderful. I'm sure everybody would really love that. Helen would like to know, how do you find time to write with a family? Do you write at home, somewhere outside of your home? What is kind of your writing routine?
I will answer this in both pre-pandemic and pandemic ways. So pre-pandemic, I had a pretty regular writing schedule. My children would go off to school and I would write while they were at school. And I would usually kind of write in the morning and then working out is a really important part of my writing process. Something about moving my body always moves my brain. And so whenever I'm having trouble with a scene, I go out and I go for a walk or I go to the gym. And then I come home and I work a little bit more and write down all the thoughts I had while I was working out. And then usually I also work late at night, kind of, after everyone is asleep, the kind of 10 to midnight. Writers tend to be early risers or night owls. I can never, there are all these writers out there who write from like 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. I cannot do that. I'm at the other end of the day. But now during the pandemic, I have to say not much writing is happening. I think I just have the 10 to 12 slot left. But I've been doing a lot of thinking. I've been doing a lot of reading as much as I can. I have very young children. They're 6 and 3. So there's just not time for that. But Ann Patchett says, sometimes I'm writing and sometimes I'm living. So right now I'm living, and that's okay.
Well, we're glad you're living because we want more of your books.
Thank you.
Marianne says that you are so knowledgeable and such a gifted communicator. In addition to writing, do you plan to teach ever again?
Oh, I miss teaching very much. I loved teaching. I feel like it was such a privilege to get to teach, and I had absolutely incredible, brilliant students, and it was, it was one of the most exciting and wonderful experiences of my life. So I would love to get to go back to teaching. But I think right now, writing and children and teaching was one thing too many. So I took a pause on teaching plus directing as well. So, but I hope to get back to it. And I get to speak at school sometimes and travel around and go to school. So that's been really lovely.
You mentioned kind of when you were talking about before and after the book deal, Christopher would like to say he's another Shipley alum, the one you did not know, and kind of tying into reading that book, is there anything you learned from the writing and publishing process this time around that you wish you could go back and tell your former self?
I think it has been wonderful to get to meet other writers and realize that all those things, all that frustration of writing a draft is completely normal. That, writing a bad draft happens to absolutely everyone. Throwing out your entire manuscript happens all the time. That, it's just part of the process. I think that when I was first writing Song of Achilles, which took me 10 years, and partially it took me 10 years because I was teaching and directing and doing all this stuff at the same time, but partially it took me 10 years because I had no idea how to write a novel, and I had to teach myself how to write a novel. And that I would feel so frustrated with myself, and I would feel like, why can't I just get it? Why can't I just write it the first time and get it right? And so being part of the publishing process makes me realize just how common that is, that that's what's happening to everybody. And that's been very comforting. So now when I'm struggling with a scene, I just know that that's part of the process. That's just something I have to go through. I have to go down all the wrong paths to find the right path. And it isn't, you know, I think we tend to see bad drafts as something like a setback as opposed to just part of the process. So getting perspective on that has been incredibly helpful. And also how, you know, passionate so many people in this world are about stories and books and readers. I mean, the libraries, the independent bookstores like Main Point Books, the agents out there. I mean, I feel like that there are so many people out there who are just, you know, it's a wonderful, it definitely has its problems. The world of publishing, I don't want to paint an overly rosy view, but, you know, I also spend a lot of time talking about the books that I love, which is wonderful.
Okay, so we are coming to a close. So I'm going to ask you kind of two last questions. One from Carol. She just wanted you to quickly talk about the 4 major myths about Circe that you wanted to make sure you hit. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to tie it up with, were there aspects of Circe that you kind of had to force yourself to write about because you didn't like her that way, or did you fully embrace her? That's from Shar. And then finally, they want to see your cat.
Oh yes, I'll get her. Finally, she stopped doing what she was doing, so I think I can get her. We're in the process of moving, so I'm going to have to apologize for the moving boxes, which you're going to see when I go get her. But so hang on. The first question was the 4 pillars. Yeah. So the first one was from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The Metamorphoses are Ovid's myths about transformation. It's his great epic work. This is where all those myths about women getting turned into trees and birds and rocks come from. And so of course he has to write about Circe, the goddess of transformations. And he tells the story of a love triangle between her and Glaucus, a god who used to be a human, and the nymph who is known as Scylla. This is a spoiler for the novel, but it is in Ovid. And I was very interested in that story. Now, his version of Circe, he makes her very, very pathetic, very lovelorn, sort of like, you know, the woman scorned. She's constantly falling in love with the wrong guy and he's not that into her, and then she lashes out. But what interested me about that love triangle was actually the fact that I feel like it reveals this internalized misogyny on Circe's part, that she is really angry at Glaucus, but the person she lashes out at is Scylla. So I knew I wanted to kind of take that story but reform it. I wanted to, one thing that Ovid doesn't address at all is sort of Circe having to live with the consequences of having done this terrible thing to another woman, and what happens, you know, the destruction that this moment of immature rage creates. So that was one of them. Then there was Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, tells the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. And Medea, of course, shows up in that. Medea is Circe's niece, the daughter of her brother, Aeetes. And Medea and Jason have done a bunch of bad stuff, escaping from Medea's father with the Golden Fleece. And they actually have done so much bad stuff that they have sort of blood poison on them. They have, the Greek word is miasma. They have like blood pollution on their hands. And so you can't go around with blood pollution in the ancient world. So they go to Circe's island to be cleansed of this blood pollution. So I kept that idea that they go to Circe's island, but all the scene between, you know, the 2 great witches of ancient literature, aunt and niece, I completely created. So that was really fun, knowing that scene was coming for me. Then there was the Odyssey. And lastly, the very, very last part of the novel was inspired by an ancient epic that we don't have anymore. It has not survived. Speaking of sort of how much has not survived from the ancient world. It's called the Telegony. And the Telegony tells the story. All we have is just a summary of it. We have someone referencing it. It's like it's like a Wikipedia stub from the ancient world. But what this Wikipedia stub tells us about the Telegony is that Telegonus is Circe's son with Odysseus, that when Odysseus sails away from Circe's island, she's pregnant, she has a son, she raises him on her island. And when he comes of age, he goes looking for his father. some stuff happens. I'm leaving it in case there are some spoilers. And then he brings Penelope and Telemachus, Penelope's son with Odysseus, back to the island of Aiaia. So Penelope and Circe meet in this epic that we don't have. And so I knew I wanted to use that. And there is one very small detail from the Telegony that I also used, which is that she arms her son with a stingray tail spear. And I knew I wanted to use that detail because I thought I just had this, you know, this is one of those moments where as a novelist, I never really understand the things that grab me and that, you know, I feel kind of like, oh, that. But there was something about this idea of her making a stingray tail spear for her son. Like, what an incredible witchy weapon. But my brain immediately starts saying, yeah, but it's not a regular stingray. It's like the lord of all stingrays. And she has to go down to the bottom of the ocean. And like, you know, I don't know why my brain started creating this scene, but that was the scene. So I knew that that scene was coming, actually. But I didn't know quite where it was going to be. And what I eventually realized is that the scene was kind of one of the turning points of the novel. It was one of the most significant pieces, and actually it's kind of Circe's journey to the underworld, that oftentimes epic heroes have to, you know, go talk to the dead. They have to go down into the underworld and kind of contend with their own, with who they are, in the face of, you know, this great power. And so that was kind of my Circe going down to the dead. But I had no idea. I wasn't thinking, you know, now I can kind of explain that in retrospect. But at the time, it was just this idea that seized me, that she had to go down to the underworld. So, so I guess those were the 4 pillars.
Wonderful.
Madeline, so I know we're at 8 o'clock and we don't want to keep you too long because I know you have other things to attend to. Is there anything else that we should talk about before you go?
Let me show you my cat. So I apologize for the boxes you're about to see. This is, all right, here she comes. Say hi, Sippy. Say hi. Want to say hello?
And what's her name?
Her name is Siffy, which is it's short. I guess it's long for Sif, who is the Norse goddess of spring, which is when we got her. Sif is also Thor's wife, but I don't like to introduce her that way. I like to introduce her as herself. So this was the only name that all our family could agree on. Turns out the holdout was our 3-year-old. She was a real tough critic. The other 3 people in the family could all agree on several different names, but only the 3-year-old only liked Sif, so I guess she really named the cat.
Okay, well, I think you've just made a number of audience members very happy. So,
well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for putting up with my cat playing in the background, and thank you so much to the library for having me. This was such a pleasure. Goodbye to the Weigels and to everyone.
All right, thank you so much. It was really great talking to you, and this was just wonderful. So thank you again for joining us tonight.
Oh, such a pleasure, such a pleasure. Everyone stay safe, wear your mask.